Bar a complete miracle, Russia won't be at the 2027 Rugby World Cup. Sitting in the middle of a political and economic sanction purgatory for the last 2.5 years, the Bears have only really been able to sit and watch other countries take part in international test matches. But how is Russia finding their time in solitude? Are there still games being played within their borders? And what is the state of the sport looking like in such uncertain times? By the turn of the millennia, rugby in Russia had practically died out. When the Soviet Union had collapsed in the early 90s, a lot of the high-established domestic clubs found themselves as part of other independent countries, largely thanks to the bigger rugby communities being based in the Asian/Eurasian areas of the Soviet Union, as they saw it as more of a social sport than their Moscow counterparts. The economic fallout of the collapse then meant that the clubs in the European side of Russia began to disband. Beforehand, they were able to pay their players full-time wages, disguised as salaries from local businesses in order to avoid the IRB's strict amateurs-only rules on rugby union. At this point, the Russian Rugby Union was essentially forced to start over again with its establishment. However, the tide of fortune soon changed for them. Italy's arrival into the Six Nations resulted in a restructure of what's now known as the Rugby European Championship. In the Azzurri's place came the Bears, and from there onwards, momentum grew quickly for Russian rugby, making it all the way into the final pool of European qualification for the World Cup in 2002. Russia missed out on a repechage spot thanks to them fielding ineligible South African players in their squad. You'll get used to hearing stories like that as the video series goes on. From there, the Russian Rugby Union decided that it was time to get serious with their development of the sport across the country, successfully managing to get the 2003 and 2007 World Cups aired on Freeview television nationwide, despite not featuring in either tournament. In 2004, they moved their headquarters a casual 4,500 kilometers west from the Siberian city of Krasnoyarsk to Moscow in order to boost growth of the sport in Russia's European cities. The top domestic league was then made professional in 2005, and Russian rugby grew significantly, going from a sport that was practically dead to 21,000 registered rugby players nationwide by 2007. The following year, Rugby Sevens had become an official sport in the Olympic Games, the result of which saw the Russian government begin funding the union in order for them to compete at the tournament. But the Bears saw the bigger picture. Instead of just investing in their Sevens program, they further built up the sports infrastructure around the country. By the time that Russia had qualified for their inaugural World Cup in 2011, attendance figures and playing standards in their domestic leagues were rising. Financial growth was healthy, and a deal had been made with World Rugby for Moscow to host the 2013 Rugby Sevens World Cup. Going into New Zealand up against tough group stage opponents, the Bears knew they couldn't compete for results, and so they focused on getting as many points as possible in order to make the highlight reels and further promote themselves to the rugby world. Scoring tries for fun even if the opposition was, well, doing the exact same thing. Russia finished bottom of the pool, but to this day are the highest try scorers for a bottom placed team at the World Cup, something that showed just how good this team could be. At this point, the Bears were ranked 16th in the world and runners-up in the European Championship. This was the highest that they'd ever been ranked and showed a massive turnaround from where they were 11 years prior. However, Russia ran into a huge problem. They had the infrastructure, but they didn't have the personnel. Despite the ever-growing player pool, rising attendances at club games, and increased funds from sponsors, there wasn't enough high-quality Russian coaches out there to continue raising the standard of play, and so they turned to foreign coaches in order to further develop. A development issue that still affects Russian rugby to this day. Rugby union is the 7th largest sport in Russia by player and supporter numbers, but when it's compared to the likes of football and ice hockey, it's still very much a niche sport in the eyes of the Russian public. Head coach at the time, Nikolai Nerush, stepped down after the 2011 tournament alongside Steve Diamond, the director of Russian rugby, and in their place came a series of coaches that failed to have positive impacts on the team. 7 years and 5 coaches later, Russia were no longer a top side in European rugby and were far from World Cup qualification. But after a series of scandals had unfolded between Spain, Belgium and Romania, Russia ironically found themselves qualifying for 2019 as a result of being the least corrupt side in all of it. 19 points and 1 try later, the Bears crashed out of Japan as shadows of their former selves, once again finishing bottom of the group, but without registering a single point in their last 2 games. And this is where we now catch up to today's date. COVID came and went, war broke out, and Russia found itself in purgatory as a result of political and economic sanctions. So how is Russian rugby coping with their time in solitude? Just like with every other sport in Russia, the domestic clubs, for the most part, are still playing as usual. In fact, you can still watch and follow teams in the Premier League through Russia Rugby's YouTube channel, as well as numerous sporting websites. Are the national teams still playing games? Yes, but not against international teams. The rugby team was banned outright by World Rugby from playing against all international sides. This means that they instead had to get creative with their opposition. Russia played against a Barbarians team consisting of foreign players based in Russia. They lost on both occasions. The Bears then played against their under-19s team in a game. They also lost that. The biggest issue that the squad faces is that standards are dropping as a result from no test matches being played, as key players are retiring through their age and not being replaced by players with test match experience. Looking back at the last Russian squad to feature in a European Championship, there was only one player under the age of 30 to have had 20 plus caps. That was 27-year-old Evgeny Mishechkin. To make matters worse, he was also the only player under the age of 30 to have had 10 plus caps for Russia within this squad. The average age of that team is currently 30 years old, meaning that most of them are unlikely to feature within the next World Cup. So we've spoken about some of the ways in which Russian rugby has tried to work their way around the sanctions. But who is actually in charge of the union during this whole ordeal? Since 2018, Russian rugby has been run by a man called Igor Artemyev. This is crucial because Artemyev was a former head of the Russian Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. Because of his previous position in the Russian government, Artemyev had a huge political and financial influence. Over the course of 3 years, Artemyev raised the budget of the union from 425 million rubles to 2 billion Russian rubles. A further 1.5 billion rubles was then split between all the professional Russian clubs by 2021, and this resulted in Russian rugby having a higher budget than all of the other European Championship teams combined. In November 2022, Artemyev looked to sign a major deal with South African rugby using his political influence. Russia and South Africa are part of a political union known as BRICS. Speaking to both the head of South African Rugby Union as well as the Minister of Sport in South Africa, Artemyev was part of a larger scale effort by the Russian government to arrange sporting competitions between BRICS members in an attempt to steer the way around the bans and sanctions that were in place in worldwide sporting events. A lot of these details are unknown, but the idea was to arrange some form of competition between Russian and South African rugby teams, including regular club and international games played against one another. To my knowledge, this deal collapsed shortly after it became public information in November 2022. Presumably thanks to interventions from both World Rugby and political sanctions. So what are the plans for Russian rugby by the time that the sanctions are lifted? Firstly, they're aiming for a spot in the 2031 Rugby World Cup after losing their bid to host the 2027 World Cup. This is something that's bound to help with financial recovery as Russia continues to rebuild in purgatory. Russia also plans to rejoin their clubs into the European Super Cup, a competition that's the equivalent of a second-tier URC based around the Tier 2 nations of Europe. Russia were a founding member of this competition and were joined along the likes of Spain, Portugal, Israel, Czechia, the Netherlands, Belgium and Georgia. I imagine that Russia will also try to have players and coaches developed for competing against their foreign counterparts by the time that the sanctions are lifted, relying more on Russian and homegrown based talent rather than international coaches to give them a bit of an edge. Lastly, I imagine that Russian rugby is trying to have their teams reintegrated back into European competitions such as the Challenge Cup and the Champions Cup, even if the latter is a lot more difficult to qualify for. Russian rugby is in a bizarre stalemate situation. On one hand, they have plenty of time to prepare for 2031 and develop their domestic game into a stronger entity, but on the other hand, the lack of test matches make it almost impossible for upcoming players to compete at international level. Russia's efforts over the last 24 years at rebuilding their rugby union haven't been for nothing, but I can't shake off the feeling that it's going to be a long time after 2031 that we actually see them in a World Cup again. But hey, rugby's a weird sport. Considering how quickly they rose to new heights in the past, I wouldn't put it past them to do it again, once they are allowed back into the wilderness of Test rugby. I guess we'll never know until we get closer to the time.